Welcome to the History of Western Civilization. This is Professor Allen, and here is lecture number 1. So, what is Western civilization? Well, Western civilization is really more of a cultural aspect and idea rather than a geographic one. And Western civilization, as we know it today, is focused on European cultures, American cultures, meaning not just North America, but also Central America as well as South America, and then also includes Australia and New Zealand. And so that is what people typically identify as Western civilization and Western culture, as opposed to the Eastern culture, which is more of anything to do with Asia and also Africa as well. So that's Western civilization in a nutshell. Well, before we really talk about all of that as a whole thing, we have to kind of talk about where people originated. And that is going to be in these hotspots, as you see around the world on this map right here, these blue and pink or purple areas around the map. And the ones that we're going to be mostly focused on in this course early on are going to be these two. The one that's centralized on the Nile River in Egypt, as well as a little bit more of North Africa area, as well as the one over in the Middle East. There's also another one where mankind first originated in the world, which isn't actually on this map. It's actually in this area right here, in an area called the Afar Triangle in Ethiopia, which is right about there where my cursor is right there. And so that's kind of where mankind originated and started spreading out from these two areas, as well as the others into their own regions respectively. But these two areas kind of started settling more into Europe as well. And so these are the ones that we're going to be focusing on in the early portion of this course. While before we go on to talking about any of those civilizations or anything, let's talk about a few kind of terms historically that we'll be using throughout this course. The first one is the word circa, right here. Circa. It is also abbreviated with the lowercase c and a period, usually on slideshows or in books. And what the word circa means is it means about or around, when talking about a specific year or set of years. So if I was to say the year 2000, I'm talking about the exact year 2000, right? Only about 20 years ago, since today is 2020. And so 20 years ago, I would be talking about the year 2000. But if I said circa 2000, or if it was typed on a slideshow or in a book, C period 2000, that would be meaning around the year 2000. So it could mean anywhere from like 2 or 3 years before, or 3 or 4 years after, maybe even up to 5 or 10 years before or after. If we're talking about like 10,000 years ago, like circa 10,000 years ago, then we could possibly even be talking about like 300, 400, even up to 1,000 or so years on either side of that 10,000 area of circa. So circa is about or around. It's kind of an estimate. B.C.E. is another term that we'll use a lot in this course. In fact, over half of this course is going to be in the period known as B.C.E., which many of you might have heard of the term B.C., as in 1500 B.C. And what B.C. means is before Christ. And anything before the year 1 is termed to be before Christ, as in before Jesus Christ was born. And we'll talk about that later on in this course. But that is more of a religious kind of time connotation, as opposed to what historians actually use, which is B.C.E. So the correct and proper method of discussing time periods is either B.C.E. or C.E., as opposed to what people use today is A.D. Now, you may have heard of A.D. as well. Today is 2020, of course, which is 2020 A.D. In the religious calendar, but in historical calendars, we're actually 2020 CE is the current year. Well, what's AD mean? Well, it actually does not mean after death. And if you were thinking that, that's okay. A lot of people think that, but that's not what it means. It actually means Anno Domini, which is a Latin saying. And we will discuss that again in another course, in another class and lecture, but we will discuss that later on in the semester. CE is current era, so we are technically 2020 CE. So, in addition to that, the world is also kind of divided into really two phases of early human history before we even get into really like less current history, thousands of years ago. And so paleoanthropologists, anthropologists are the guys that study humans. Well, paleoanthropologists are the ones that study early humans. And paleoanthropologists divide early human history, not just human history, but early human history, into two phases, Paleolithic and Neolithic. So what are those two terms? Well, Paleolithic is the Old Stone Age. It means the Old Stone Age, really long time ago. It is believed to have begun roughly around 1 million BCE. So that is 1,002,020 years ago, at least, okay? Circa around 1 million BCE. And it lasted until about 11,000 BCE. So almost a million years long, this just Paleolithic age lasted. Almost a million years long, this chronological era. And so 11,000 BCE was what? 13,020 years ago, give or take? And during this time, there were lots and lots of different pre-human versions of humans, okay? Where they weren't quite human as we are today. Right here, you can see Homo sapiens right here. Well, Homo sapiens are what we are today. That's what our species or race is today, Homo sapiens. But as you can see, there's a bunch of other ones that are very similar in skull structure as well as body structure and skeletal structure in general to humans. Many of them lasted a very long time. As you can see, we've only lasted from about 30,000 BCE, so about 32,000 years now we've been around. Okay? Humans have been around for 32,000 years on this planet as we are today. Okay? And does that mean that there were others that lasted before us? Well, yes, obviously. There were many different types of near-human races that lasted, some of them, for over 1 million years, like this one right here and this one here, lasted for a very long period of chronological time, but they never really evolved into anything that was able to really use tools or have a culture or civilizations or anything, and never really got out of like cave life living, okay? And many died off from whatever multiple different reasons. And so there's entire courses and things that could be taught on that. So we're not going to spend any time on that. But moving on in the Paleolithic Old Stone Age, let's talk about the first appearance of humans, about 30,000 BCE. So again, 32,000 years ago, because you add 2020, or what year we're in now, to how many years BCE it is, to figure out how long ago it was. And Homo sapiens sapiens is our correct species name, okay? Because there are a couple different types that were Homo sapiens with another word at the end of it, for the third word, where they were just slightly different than us. And so these humans, about 32,000 years ago, originated in the Afar Triangle, right here, which if this is Africa, obviously, and Europe would be right here, in the Middle East here, okay? We're talking about this section on this map here, which is going to be right here, so right there. And so the Afar Triangle is in the present-day country of Ethiopia, which is, again, in Africa. It is one of the places that recent discoveries, almost the most recent ones we've found yet, trace the earliest humans ever living. Okay? And what did the Afar Triangle look like? Well, kind of like this. Kind of scary if you look at it. It's kind of like almost like a hellish on earth kind of style place, because of hot springs and stuff like that. But not too far from there were kind of like more lush jungles and plains and stuff, which have since kind of dried up. But back then, during that period, there was a lot of water and precipitation in that part of Africa. And so it was much more lush with forests and jungle-like style terrain. But that's what it kind of looks like today. And this is kind of an area where it shows it here, where some mountains, and then this is the Afar Depression, where a lot of the first humans started out, again, in Africa. And so that is where the original humans kind of began. And if we actually took a look from orbit, from space, we can actually see the curve of the Earth, because the Earth is round. And you also can see where the Afar Triangle is, right? This area right here. And it's kind of like triangular looking if you look at it, with the mountains kind of bordering the two sides. Kind of like here, and then the mountains would have been over here, right? And so that's the Afar Triangle in Ethiopia from orbit. Well, the first people that popped up, the first Homo sapiens sapiens, the first humans, were nomads, a term called nomads. Okay, and again, we're talking about here, and then other ones kind of start springing up and migrating to here and here, as well as over here and a couple different places here, like on the first map of the slideshow, that yellow one. And what's a nomad? Well, a nomad is someone that moves around a lot. They would actually stay and live in an area with their large group, like a large tribe of people, okay? Sometimes several hundred people, sometimes less, sometimes a little bit more, depending. And these nomads would live there for a while, and what they would do for food is they would hunt for food, hunt animals. They would fish for, of course, fish, okay, in rivers or lakes or streams. And then they would, or off on the side of the coast, and then they would also gather food, meaning that they would pick berries or plants and vegetables of different types and stuff, eat leaves and different things, and sometimes, of course, they would find poisonous ones, and several people would get sick or die, and they would understand right away, or pretty quick, that no, don't eat that, because our fellow nomad, early human, died from that. And so they were actually quite intelligent. Again, they are exactly identical genetically and everything to us. They just didn't quite understand how to do things yet. Okay? And so they would hunt, fish, and gather food. They did not produce food. That is one thing you need to understand, is they were not food producers. They were gatherers and hunters. Hunter-gatherers is the term. Hunter-gatherers as opposed to food producers. What's a food producer? Well, you probably already know this, but just in case, a food producer is someone that is like we are today as humans. We raise food. Maybe not you specifically, but people do raise food somehow, right? We have farms where we grow crops, okay, grow plants, or we also have farms that also grow, what, animals, right? And we eat them as opposed to hunting for them. So that is what a food producer is today and what it was back then, but they didn't have any food producers back then, okay? Well, things would start changing eventually. Again, hunters and gatherers is what they were right here. And they started using tools. They had to, of course, use tools to hunt for food and dig up some kind. Sometimes they would eat roots and things, as opposed to just the plant itself, kind of like as potatoes are roots, right? Now, they didn't really have potatoes, but they had something similar and stuff like that. So sometimes they would do that. They would dig up the food and eat the roots of a plant, as opposed to the plant's leaves. And so, over time, they eventually became more than just hunter-gatherers. And as they were beginning to get into this kind of idea of food production, they were also just changing culturally. They were actually beginning to have a culture. And one of the first cultural things that we have as humans in a history was grave goods. As you can see right here, there is this is a skeleton right here. This is how he would have been found in his burial plot, okay, where he would have been found and dug up by paleoanthropologists studying him or her. And they would have found him with several tools, okay, which look like this. They might have been ones that were used as knives, or maybe a fishing hook or something like that, and tied with string, or maybe some other kind of tool another way. They also found that he had several pots, or cup-sized pots, made of clay, pottery, with him, as well as a couple other little trinkets and things, if you look closely. And so that's kind of this idea of grave goods. Why would this person be buried with this? Now, did he bury himself with this? No, obviously not. His relatives or friends or other tribe members would have done that. And why did they do that? Well, they had this idea that that person, after they died, would need those tools to be able to survive in the afterlife. They didn't understand what the afterlife would be. People today still don't have this concept, have a full concept of what the afterlife is going to really be like. And so they had that idea back then. Their superstitious or their religion or ideas back then and culture back then gave ideas that that person was going to need some kind of good in the future, some tools and things like that. So they would actually bury them with little things like that for the afterlife. Well, another thing that we've got from this period of the Old Stone Age is some art, okay? And as you can see right here, this is a rib bone, okay, from the Paleolithic era. And people have carved into it. People back then carved little, animals into it. As you can see, this one's kind of damaged, and this one's not as clear, but we do have very clear images on these two. And so this one right here, the one with the beard, is an ibex. An ibex is kind of like an antelope-style animal, okay? And then there's a reindeer, which has antlers. As you can see, it's got big antlers right here, just like a regular deer. And so both of those were probably carved onto this piece of, again, rib. This was an animal rib bone, okay? And they were probably carved there, hoping that this person would have luck finding those animals out in the wilderness while going on hunts. And when they found those animals, they would hunt them and kill them, right, for food and bring them back to the tribe. And sometimes they would go away for days or weeks even or so to bring back a large amount of food to the main tribe, which was a few miles away. And so they would come back and bring these materials and things with them, and everyone would be hoping that they would have luck finding these creatures. Because if they didn't have luck finding these animals in the herd, then what was going to happen? Well, the nomads were going to have to pick everything up and move. And sometimes that would be moved to 100 or so miles away, sometimes even 1,000 miles away. And means bring everything you've got with you, which again wasn't that much for people back then, but to move that far on foot was quite a big trek. Well, some of the other tools they had back then were some of these right here, obviously. Projectile points. A lot of people know them as arrowheads or spearheads or something like that is the colloquial terms today. But the correct term for these items are projectile points. Because, as you can see, some of them are larger than others. Well, this one would be maybe good for like a bow and arrow, like an arrow tip. This one would be maybe good for a knife or a spear. Same with this one or this one. And so larger ones were pretty good for certain things and smaller ones were good for other things. In fact, early on in my career, one of my first historical jobs was actually categorizing projectile points for another university years ago. And in fact, the number of projectile points I ended up having to go through in these old cigar boxes found by this one professor beforehand was about 8,000. I had to categorize 8,000 projectile points that had been just found in North Louisiana. Just those ones, let alone anywhere else. So there are thousands upon thousands of these projectile points, not just in our state, but also around the country, around the world in general. Okay? And so, and they have different tools and different looks and stuff made of different stone and all, and they all get categorized different ways. Of course, you're never going to have to worry about that maybe unless you go into some kind of in-depth history. Well, let's talk a little bit more about this art, but on a bigger scale. Well, they started actually carving or painting that kind of art in caves, as opposed to just carving it in a bone. Okay, with maybe a sharp projectile point to scratch it into the bone. They would also scratch it into caves, or sometimes use some kind of like coloring to paint it onto a wall. Two of the most famous caves that have art in them that we can still actually go and see today is one in Castellon in Spain, which is here. And as you can see, there's a bunch of people with bows and arrows hunting animals, right? Hunting these reindeer or these deer. And they've got little arrows sticking in them, meaning that they're hoping that they're going to have good luck hunting them, right? And this one right here is in Libya, in present-day Libya, which is in North Africa, and it's called the Cave of Beasts, the Cave of Beasts. And as you can see, there's people, as well as larger animals, like big buffalo or bison-like style animals, or almost like a bull in size, right, or bull or cow in size. And so that's that. 90% of cave art are of animals. 90% of all pictures on all of the caves, painted or carved by these Paleolithic era people, were of animals. 90%. Okay? And 10% of those animals are actually being shown killed. Okay? The other 10% is of like people and plants and other things like the sky and clouds and stuff like that. The idea of not wanting to really put pictures of killing animals or dead animals is because you want living animals out in the wild, right? You want to go find a living animal, okay? Otherwise, what are you going to find? If you're hoping that this is whatever you paint is exactly going to be what you see, are you going to find any dead animals next time or not? Probably not, right? So that's the issue. They would end up actually doing it so that we would end up always having these animals pictured would be the ones that they want to hunt for food, as well as the ones that were that they wanted to see, and they wanted to see them alive. This was also very unlikely to tied to any worship. They didn't really have any religion or anything like that. And many of these cave art drawings are actually very, very deep in the cave. And so deep that people wouldn't have been able to get to them other than one or two people. So there wouldn't have been like a big ceremony at the tip of the mouth of the cave with all these people drawing it or anything. It would have been only like one person going deep into the cave and drawing it. And so around 12,000 B.C.E., so about 14,000 years ago, we had the end of the last major ice age. And the end of the last major ice age was pretty big for humanity. It's kind of when people start being able to migrate out of just North Africa and the Middle East and those southern other areas on that first map, but also into now Europe, as well as also into other places. Also during this time, there was a lot of basically an ocean or a sea from the Mediterranean Sea here expanded into the Sahara Desert back then. And a lot of the Sahara Desert back then was actually jungle or actual covered by water. And when the glaciers kind of retreated north with all of it melting here, the rain and everything the heavy rains shifted north. And so the Sahara Desert became a desert from a jungle. We also have during this period glaciers retreating northwards, and as they did that as well, also the animals start also traveling northwards to newer, different areas. And along with it, the nomads would travel along following those big giant herds of thousands of animals, and hundreds of people would go following with them to make sure that their food source kept around. Now, this was the last major ice age. Okay, we will actually have several mini ice ages discussed in this course. I can think of at least two, if not even more like 3 or 4, okay, which I will mention all of them, and they all have big impacts on history. And they still happen. Every now and then we end up having climate change where we end up having a little bit of a colder period for hundreds, if not years, sometimes only decades. And so it varies, but it does actually affect the whole world at times. And it can have drastic effects, especially if the world isn't ready for it or the people aren't ready for it. And we will talk about that in this course a couple different times. But again, around 14,000 years ago, the last major ice age ended. And when that ended, people started realizing they could kind of start settling down. Those nomads started settling down because they realized, I don't have to follow the herd, because there's now more herds in this area. Or now we're in a valley where the herd can't really get away. There's better fauna or better plant life and different animals and things here for food, as opposed to just the one herd that we were following. So we don't need to move around. And when they stopped moving around, people started also having more children. And reason is birth rates increase. Well, why do birth rates increase with settled existence? Well, if you think about it, if a woman has a child and they've got to travel several hundred miles on foot to follow the herd, are they going to be able to carry more than one child that is very young? Probably not. Especially since they're also going to be having to carry all of their food with them as well, or other belongings with them. As yes, the man of the family might do so as well, but are they going to carry necessarily the child? Maybe not. Maybe they would. But even if each of them were carrying a child, would they be able to carry more than one child? Probably not as well. And so when they start settling down into one place, people started having more children. And children actually started surviving more because they didn't have to travel hundreds or dozens of miles in a few weeks to keep up with the food. Well, of course, these birth rates increase what? Population as a whole. And this increased population increases the need for food. So we're going to have to find more food sources other than just hunting and gathering those plants and hunting those animals. Well, what would happen? Well, they started domesticating animals for a stable food supply. Domesticating animals, as in raising animals themselves, okay, kind of like a farm, and growing food themselves, planting the food. And so that begins the Neolithic era, which is the New Stone Age. The New Stone Age is Neolithic. It roughly started in circa 11,000 BCE, and it lasted until about circa 4,500 BCE. So that's about 6,500 years ago, right? And it started about 13,000 years ago. Other historians say that it actually started about circa 10,000 years ago, 10,000 BCE, so about 12,000 years ago, and lasted until 3,000 BCE, give or take, because circa, also about 5,000 years ago, okay? So either one of these is correct if you're ever really asked on a question about that kind of thing for when the Neolithic era is. And what the Neolithic era is it represents man control over nature, okay? It represents man's control over this nature, which is really this agriculture replacing gathering. No longer the hunter-gatherers, but now you're actually growing food, as well as not just growing food, as in plants, but you're also having your own farm animals. And domestication of animals starts replacing hunting around the year 9,000 BCE, which took a little bit longer than just growing food, okay? They started growing food first, and then or around the same period, around 9,000, and they started domesticating animals around then as well. The first few animals domesticated, we have evidence in the country of Iran, okay? And those were pigs, goats, and sheep. Why pigs, goats, and sheep? Well, pigs and goats, they kind of will eat almost anything, and they don't really need much TLC, right? Tender loving care. You can just kind of leave a pig or a goat alone, and they'll do their own thing. And pigs especially will have tons of babies, okay? Piglets galore. And pigs would end up having almost as many children in a litter as, or piglets in a litter, as rabbits, okay? So, yeah, I mean, it's just tons of pigs. Easy to grow. You really just have to give them a little bit of food and water, and they're good to go. And so this was a steady supply of meat, as well as the goat and sheep, the skins, the fur, right? The wool, were good for clothing, as well as other items. And then, such as, tents, blankets. Usually you domesticated the first animals you would eat, so they really didn't have pets. These were ones for food, okay? And around 9,000 BCE, around that same period, we have crops beginning to grow. Towns and villages start popping up around this period as well, during the Neolithic era. Around 6,500 BCE to around 3,500 BCE. So about 8,000 years ago to about 5,000 and a half years ago. Okay? It was what becomes known as the Age of the Village. And we have at this period something called sedentary agriculture, meaning that settled, non-nomadic people are beginning to grow this food and things like that. So again, it's that growing, settling down, making a home, and having maybe a house, or maybe just still a tent, and having like kind of a farm. Okay, and eventually that tent would grow into some kind of like mud style building or brick building, brick or stone building. And most farming villages were small. They were between about 200 to 1,000 people. Okay, and everyone in the village was involved in agriculture somehow. Everyone. No matter what you did something for it. Where it might have been that you were actually taking care of the animals, or you were the one that was killing them, and making sure that they were the meat was divided up equally to people. Or you were watering the plants, or planting the plants. And then when grain or whatever had to be harvested, everyone would be doing that, because harvesting and planting seasons were one thing that everyone could get involved in. Once the grain is harvested, okay, or the crop is harvested, how would you store it? How would you also transport water to your plants? Well, you could use your hands like in a little cup, but is that going to get you anywhere very fast? No. So they actually started with pottery, as well as weaving of baskets. Well, baskets aren't that great to carry water, right? But they would carry grain and other plants and stuff in it. And then also they started figuring out how to make cloth. Catalhoyuk, or Catalhoyuk, depending on the spelling, okay, and the town of Jericho, which is mentioned in the Bible, okay, are both examples of this age of the village kind of style village. And this is actually a model of one of them. And they would actually get pretty big, with sometimes walls and stuff around them to protect themselves. Okay? So, next time we will begin with the Copper Age.